Please rise and follow Commissioner Owens in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Please place your right hand over your heart. Repeat after me.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Will the Secretary please call roll?
Commissioner Owens,
Present.
Commissioner Fermetta,
Present.
Commissioner Spathopoulos,
Present.
Vice Chair Duarte,
Present.
and Chair Dominguez is absent.
Will those in the audience please read the cover page of the agenda as it outlines the procedures which the Commission will follow? This is the time set aside for oral communications for the Planning Commission. Does any commissioner wish to express announcement or report on a conference or a meeting or request items for a future agenda? Commissioner Spathos?
None.
Commissioner Fermenta?
None.
Commissioner Owens?
I have none. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I have none. Is the Director of Community Development aware of any presentations for tonight?
Yes, Vice Chairman Duarte, we do have a presentation tonight. What we try to do is keep the Planning Commission up to speed on different things that are happening that would affect or provide information in terms of the projects that are going to come before you. The state of California is getting very, very aggressive with housing in terms of how it believes that the city should produce housing in terms of quantity, densities, and transportation-oriented development. So we're seeing a flurry of bills over the last 3 years that are coming from Sacramento, putting mandates on cities. A lot of the bills are attempting to take the local control away from cities and force them into, once again, production rates that are unattainable. Cities are also fighting back in regards to those production rates, the data, and the legislation that's coming out. 2 years ago, in January of 2018, we provided a similar presentation of the Planning Commission because that's when the wave started. It started in late 16, and in 17 it really started to land. I think we had 15 new bills and that were introduced in 2017 and put into place in 2018, and we're seeing the same thing again. It's just not slowing down. So we wanted to provide you an update in terms of where the state was at, and also is the commissioners have experienced anytime multifamily development is proposed, the neighbors come out. And it's the common things. I can't park in front of my street, and now you're going to introduce X amount of units to my street, and it's going to make it worse. I can't take out my trash cans. We see it in even areas that are zoned for multifamily development, R3 zones or R2 zones, or when they abut R1 zones, the standard single-family residential neighborhoods. And we're going to continue to have to grapple with those issues. And I tell folks, if you want to get a sense of how communities are being built out, come to your Planning Commission meeting. We're at the forefront here, and we're at the front line in terms of what neighbors are experiencing and what we're grappling with in terms of our design standards, our zoning, and our applications that are coming in. So once again, we wanted to provide you information in terms of what's happening at the state and how it's going to affect us. Tonight we have Lauren Langer, who's a partner at Best & Krieger. They're one of the two law firms that provide advice and policy and direction to the city. With that, I'll turn it over to Lauren, and she can start a presentation.
Great, thank you. Good evening.
Maybe.
Get this going.
Mary? The click. It sleeps.
There we go.
Yeah, it sticks.
Okay. Good evening. As Community Development Director Schindler mentioned, my name's Lauren Langer. I'm a partner with Best & Krieger. And we have all been dealing with a slew of housing bills that we just heard about. And so one thing that our firm has been doing recently is creating a working group of lawyers to read all of these bills and synthesize them and try to understand what they all mean, because they're coming at us and they're coming at us fast. So what we hope to do tonight is provide you with not only a summary of the bills and what they say, but what they actually mean and how they all work together. So the few things that we want to go over are, first of all, as from Sacramento, is housing. We're going to talk about the ADU bills and the Housing Crisis Act, stricter state enforcement of the city's housing laws, changes to density bonus law that are going to promote 100% affordable housing projects. And the buzzword of the year is going to be objective development standards. So we'll close off talking a little bit about that. As the director just mentioned, in 2017, we saw about 17 housing bills come down. We saw streamlined processing for housing projects. We saw amendments to the Housing Accountability Act. We saw inclusionary requirement clarifications. We first learned about ADUs, and we saw more CEQA streamlining processes. And these were all bills meant to force cities to approve housing projects, to really support and promote the creation of housing. So here we are, 2 years later, and we're getting more bills and a stronger message from Sacramento. What I'm about to read you in the quoted language up here are statements from Senate Bill 330. And these are the facts that the legislature are basing their decisions on. They say California is experiencing a housing supply crisis with the demand for housing outstripping supply. In 2018, California was ranked 49th out of 50 states in housing units per capita. We have 7 of the 10 most expensive real estate markets in the country. California needs an estimated 180,000 additional homes annually to keep up with population growth, and the governor calls for 3.5 million homes to be built in the next 7 years. So while the bills I'm going through are quite aggressive, this is why. Probably one of the biggest messages or one of the biggest issues that the housing development deals with is this last statement, and that's that lengthy permitting, processing, and approval times, fees, and costs for parking and other requirements exacerbate the cost of residential housing. And so the longer it takes, the more expensive it is, and the slower the housing is produced. And so all of these bills are aimed at getting more housing produced quicker. So again, 2019, the message was approve housing projects and reduce barriers to creations of housing, so that's the stick. But this time, they're going to give you some money to help you with your efforts. So at the end, I'll talk to you about a couple grant opportunities that the state has made available to at least provide cities with some resources to handle all of this new legislation that's coming down. So the first bill I want to talk about, the first tool that the legislature has come up with to deal with the housing crisis is ADUs. And I'm sure a couple years ago, the city adopted an ADU ordinance, and it was a little bit shocking at the time because it was the first time that ADUs were really required to be allowed. You had to require them in every city. And some changes that came in this past legislative cycle were now ADUs have to be allowed on multifamily lots, and to be honest, I deal with this day in and day out, and I still struggle with what that means because multifamily lots and multifamily projects by their nature allow multiple housing units on one site. But there are specific provisions in the bill about allowing your normal apartments and also having ADUs on those same sites. So that's something that you'll grapple with a little bit when your new ADU ordinance comes before you. Now the bill says that in some circumstances, you have to allow multiple ADUs on one lot, where originally the thought was you have a single-family home and you have one accessory unit in the back, and that's an accessory part of a normal single-family home. They're expanding this housing opportunity because they see it as a way to get more units built on our existing land. For ADUs that are new, a maximum 4-foot setback was in place. Most cities have a larger setback than that. Most cities have 5, 7, 8 feet in residential zones. So for new ADUs, the maximum setback is 4 feet. So you see how they're really regulating land use from up in Sacramento, which is a difficult thing to do with a one-size-fits-all approach, but this is what we have. In 2016, the bill said that if you convert a garage, which was built for parking, you could do that as long as you can fit replacement parking on your parcel, and they've gotten rid of that requirement. So no longer do you have to provide replacement parking if you convert your garage. Again, making it easier for garage conversions on tighter lots where you may not have space to put parking. The other biggest change that I saw was that until 2025, you can't require owner occupancy. And owner occupancy was really something that kept this as you have an owner living in the primary unit, and maybe you have a back unit where you have a mother-in-law or a college student, or you do have someone else renting your back unit. But no longer do you have to have an owner living on the property to utilize an ADU. And that rule will be in place for 5 years, and then they'll assess and they'll assess it. And there's no longer, can you have a minimum lot size requirement? There's a category of ADUs which go straight to your building department. They don't receive any sort of review from a planning department, and the bill expanded that category. It also said that even if you have nonconformities on the site, they're okay. You can't require them to fix nonconformities in order to build their ADU, and that was something a lot of cities did over the past few years if there was a nonconformity, and it would hold up the ADU a little bit. And then the other thing to know is that with the bill, it voids your entire ADU ordinance until you get a compliant ordinance in place. So I believe your staff is working to do an ADU replacement ordinance to bring it up in line with AB 881, and I think that will be coming before you soon. You can apply objectives, landscape and architectural standards, so the extent you have those for residential uses, you can still apply those. And basically, the rule is if you have lot coverage requirements, setbacks, any kind of rules that might limit the size of an ADU, you won't be able to apply those rules to the extent they don't let someone build an 800 square foot accessory dwelling unit that's 16 feet high with 4-foot setbacks. So it's not saying you have to get rid of all your old residential standards, but if you have them, this is what you might have to expect from new construction. So as I mentioned, you'll be preparing a conforming ordinance, and that will come before you soon. The next major bill, which I think was a little bit of a sleeper bill, and I think everyone was paying attention to SB 50 and wasn't paying as much attention to this one coming through because it's pretty significant, is SB 330. And it has restrictions on local control of housing developments. So it limits cities and counties' abilities to regulate housing developments. And the definition of that term comes from the Housing Accountability Act. So that means residential units, mixed-use projects with 2/3 square footage for residential, and transitional supportive housing. So if you have those types of projects, this bill is going to apply. And the bill makes changes to the Permit Streamlining Act, which tells you how quickly you need to be approving projects. It makes changes to the Housing Accountability Act, which puts limits on your ability to deny projects. And then it adds the new Housing Crisis Act. So the first thing the bill does is it creates a freeze, and it requires your planning department to create a preliminary application. It's sort of a checklist of everything the city wants to see. And once that is submitted, it freezes the laws in place at the time it was submitted. If you don't process a lot of zone text amendments, it's probably not that big of a deal because you're not changing your code often. But if you do process a lot of zone text amendments, you'll need to remember that the law you apply to the project is the law that was in place back when they started. And the cities will be posting a checklist on their website, which has all of the information. You can only require the information that's listed in the bill in your checklist. And you want to be specific here so that you get everything you need up front, because one of the things that I think is just very difficult to deal with is the cities will have to make historic determinations much earlier in the process. So to the extent someone is proposing a development on a site that has an eligible historic resource on it, you're going to be looking at that much earlier in the process than you're used to doing. So what they're doing is they're speeding this all up, making the cities work harder, making the process easier for developers, more complicated for city staff members to get these projects processed quickly. CEQA will still apply, and you'll still do that process, but they want the information coming in sooner. Streamlining provisions. There is now a limit that if you have one of those projects we just talked about, a residential project, and if it complies with your objective development standards, the city can't have more than 5 hearings if it's a compliant project. And a hearing means any meeting, workshop, and appeals. But that rule won't apply if a developer is asking for a legislative change. So if they want to change their zoning, or they're asking for a development agreement, things of that nature, you don't have the 5 hearing limit. But for most residential projects, if they meet your standards, you will. We give shorter approval timeframes. The Permit Streamlining Act was shortened from 120 days to 90 for projects that require an EIR, and 60 days if a project is exempt or was reviewed by a negative declaration. So staff will want to be checking the Permit Streamlining Act for additional provisions there. Okay, so the Housing Crisis Act was sort of the third piece of this bill, and it applies in urbanized areas. And I checked the Department of Housing and Community Development's website, and they have released a list of all the cities in the state that qualify as urbanized areas or affected cities subject to this bill, and Downey was on the list, so this bill will apply in this city. And it has legislative restrictions, so it's limiting some of the land use laws that you can put in place, and it also has project-specific restrictions, so we'll go through those. So the first big change is from a legislative perspective. The city cannot reduce your zoned density. Your general plan and your zoning densities for housing cannot be reduced below the amounts that you had in January 2018. So to the extent you allowed housing on various parcels and in various zones, that needs to stay the same, because again, they don't want cities going in and taking away all the residential zoning to respond to this. The only exception is if you concurrently change another parcel to allow housing, you could remove housing from a parcel. So there has to be sort of a no net loss simultaneous zoning if you were to take advantage of that exception. And they also realize that reducing density includes things such as reducing height, reducing your standard density, requiring more open space, requiring bigger setbacks or frontage requirements, because all those things have the effect of reducing the amount of housing that can go on a lot. So it's not just, reducing the number of units per acre, but it's other ways that you would reduce the size of buildings. Cities are prevented from doing that for the time being. And then if housing is a permitted use under your general plan or zoning, cities can't change that designation to remove housing. And this is a big deal. This is probably one of the first times that we've seen the legislature say, you can't do what's in your police power, what you're the local authorities on what land uses are best in your cities and in your zones. And so this was a pretty big deal to put that requirement in. There is a moratorium on moratoriums now for the next 5 years, so you can't put a housing moratorium in place. And the only exception is if you actually had a public health and safety threat, you could adopt a moratorium, but you actually have to go get approval from the Housing and Community Development Department at the state first. You can't put in growth control measures, all of those tools that cities have sometimes used to pause and see what densities they want and what zoning they want. Can't do for the time being. And then the last legislative restriction is you can't adopt new subjective design standards. So you can't enforce or impose new subjective design standards that are established on or after January 1st, 2020. And so I know that this commission and the city has been looking at some new design standards in the R1 zone, and I've been working with your staff to go through those and check them and see to what extent we've got appropriate objective standards and to what extent they might be a little too subjective, and we're gonna need to tighten them up. And we'll talk about what objective standards mean at the end. So we just wanted to let you know that we know this bill is pending. We know you have that project currently pending, and so we're gonna work together to make sure that the standards are correct. So then I'm not done, because the Housing Crisis Act has even more restrictions, has project restrictions. So I just said that you can't adopt new subjective design standards after 2020, but that also means that you can't apply them to housing projects that come before you. And this works in conjunction with the Housing Accountability Act, which has been in place for many, many years and was amended a few years ago. And it says you can only deny housing developments if they're consistent with your objective standards, if there's a specific unmitigatable impact to health or safety. And so, while we're not going to be adopting any new subjective standards, we also have to look very carefully at our existing objective standards, because they can't serve as the basis for denying a housing project. As Director Schindler was saying, residents often come out to complain about new developments that are coming out, and it's really difficult because one thing we're used to talking about is compatibility. Will a use be compatible with the neighborhood? And so what the legislature is really doing is taking that very subjective discussion away and wanting you to put in very specific standards in place to tell developers what you want to see, and moving away from those subjective discussions. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about that at the end. If you have parcels where the zoning and the general plan are inconsistent, the general plan designation is going to control for that parcel. So you'll need to check your general plan and make sure you don't have any inconsistencies. And if you do, just know when a project is proposed for that site, you're going to be looking only in your general plan for what the objective development standards are, and maybe some generally applicable zoning standards. For all housing projects, you want to be careful and watch out for reduction in density. So if there's 10 units on the site and they're developing it to build 8 units, we've got a problem, because they say no on-site reduction in the number of units. You have to replace them one for one. So if you're going to knock down a 10-unit apartment building, you have to replace it with a 10-unit apartment building or larger. And this will apply to applications that were deemed complete after January 1st. So that won't apply to any projects that you have that were deemed complete last year or you're already working on. But to the extent new applications come in starting this year, you really need to watch out for reductions in density. And then the bill goes into great lengths about what it means to demolish existing units and which units are protected, which means if units that are to be demolished were rent stabilized or restricted to low income. I don't believe you have a rent stabilization ordinance, so I don't think you'll have that category. But units that were occupied by low or very low income households, or units that were removed from the rental market, there's going to be extra rules that apply when those units are demolished. And I don't think we need to go through all this detail, but you can check in. We can check in if projects like that come about, because there'll be more restrictions on those projects as well. So the big takeaways from SB 330 are to get the preliminary application started for housing projects and pay special attention when projects come in where they're demolishing housing units. Consider adopting objective zoning standards. Review your general plan and zoning for inconsistencies. And then don't forget about the Housing Accountability Act, which has special findings for denial of any residential housing project. And all these bills kind of work hand in hand, where it's a lot more difficult to deny a housing project now, or even condition a housing project to make it smaller. So that was what I was saying at the beginning. We don't just want to think about SB 330. We need to think about how it works with the Housing Accountability Act and how all these rules have limited cities' abilities to deny housing projects. So it's more complicated for the city, but it's a simplified process for developers. We do also have stricter enforcement of housing laws, another stick and carrot. So the state is stepping up their enforcement of the housing elements and the city's compliance with their housing laws, but they're going to be providing grant funding to help cities. So the stepped up enforcement, this is something very new. We haven't seen this, where the Attorney General, if the city wasn't adopting its housing element, wasn't implementing its housing element, or doing all of the things it needs to do, the Attorney General could seek a court order against cities for housing element compliance, and if that were to happen, it would be a very long process. The court would retain jurisdiction to monitor the city for many years. There would be status conferences. There's a possibility of fines, and in the most difficult of circumstances, there would be an appointment of a receiver. However, there's going to be many opportunities where the state is going to give a city notice before this comes up. So you would be well aware and put on notice of where the state believes the city isn't complying, and you would have opportunities in public meetings such as this to deal with the issues and decide what you're going to do to comply. And then there will be, and then if you are compliant, there's much more access to funding, and you'll have preference in grant funding. So, for example, $650 million for housing for homeless assistance and prevention programs, $250 million for local government planning support grants programs, $550 million for infill infrastructure grant programs, California Home Program funds, Housing Trust Grant funds, there's tax credits, there's self-help housing funds. So there was a significant part of the state budget set aside for these grant opportunities. So that's one positive you could take away from this presentation. And so your staff will be monitoring those and doing what's necessary to apply and get the appropriate approvals in order to apply where there's some funds that could help the city meet all of these obligations. Lastly, on this enforcement of housing laws, the state imposed something called a low barrier navigation center. It's a new type of transitional housing use, and not in the other bills, but in this bill, included some requirements for how the city would process it if someone wanted to build a low barrier navigation center, which is temporary living facilities with services for people to get back on their feet. If someone wanted to build these, there's new rules for how it would be applied. So the key takeaways from this bill: housing element compliance is even more critical in light of these enforcement provisions. The housing element update process is just starting, so that's something you'll hear much more about over the coming years, but it's something to know and stay on top of, and that there'll be this funding available. One last bill before we talk about objective development standards. For many years, there's been a provision in state law allowing for affordable housing density bonuses, meaning if a developer agrees to provide a certain percentage of housing as affordable, they get bonus. They get a bigger building, and they get some extra concessions to essentially pay them back for the costs of providing the affordable housing. So that's been in the law a long time, and what this bill does is find a mechanism to promote 100% affordable housing projects. So the other type of density bonus projects, they would have a maximum of about 35% affordable units. This is a mechanism to have 100% affordable housing projects. So if you have 100% affordable, you can have up to 20% of those units be reserved for moderate income, which is a great need in the state for moderate income housing. So 20% moderate, and the other 80% would be for low income. And if a project like this comes about, they could get up to 80% of the otherwise maximum allowable density. That is a big density bonus. However, these projects are hard to finance, and I don't anticipate seeing a ton of these, but it could be possible. And then if the project is within 1/2 mile of a major transit stop, there's no density limit. And the project receive up to 4 regulatory concessions and no parking requirements. And then lastly, if it's within 1/2 mile of a transit stop, in addition to the 4 concessions, this 100% affordable project could also get a height increase of up to 3 stories or 33 feet. So again, they're looking for ways to get a lot of units built. These would be small units. It would be a lot of small units in one building. It wouldn't be, massive developments. That's how they would fit all the extra units in. So we do recommend updating your density bonus ordinance to include these provisions. It's not a major provision of your density bonus program, but if somebody comes in, staff's gonna need the guidance to know how to process this application. There was a few other significant bills with some transparency and reporting requirements, new rules related to property disposition. What didn't pass this past year was SB 50, but I believe that one is coming back, and I think it was just amended this year. So I'll see you back here in 12 months, and we can talk about that one. And then SB 5 also did not pass. I've talked to you about the to-do list, so what we can do is just spend a moment talking about objective development standards, because this is a shift. You're the planning commission. You process these projects day in and day out, and you know what the city's looking for from design and development. And so traditionally, the way we regulate land use is a mix of objective and subjective. We have things that are objective: height, density, setbacks, things you can look at those plans and you know whether they meet those requirements. But we also traditionally have used many subjective terms. We want buildings to be compatible in scale, bulk, and massing, things that can't be quantified. And I did a word search through your code today, and I think the word compatible came up about 12 times, and that's very, very standard. It's in every zoning code. So both of these types of standards always struck a nice balance of providing guidance and freedom in allowing developers and property owners to design their properties. So now we have 3 places that are requiring objective standards. We have the Housing Accountability Act, which we talked about, and if a project is consistent with all of your objective development standards, you're limited in your ability to deny it. We have SB 35 streamlining, which is a streamlined ministerial approval process for cities that haven't met their RHNA numbers. And then we have the New Housing Crisis Act. So we have the legislature, they keep adding more bills about objective standards. So what do they mean? Objective means It's a design standard that involves no personal or subjective judgment by a public official. It's uniformly verifiable by a reference or a uniform benchmark that's known to everybody before they start. So it is verifiable, it's uniform, and it's known before submittal of the application. So as I mentioned, it's really the lengthy permitting process time and all of these impediments to development and increasing costs that the legislature believes is slowing down housing production. So their thought is, you decide what objective standards you want in advance as a city. You tell developers to design that way, they design that way, and you shouldn't have grounds to want to deny them because they've built it the way you told them in a very objective way. That's the concept behind objective development standards. But as we all know in practice, you know, everyone sometimes wants to see different things. You have neighbors that are closer to the project that may be concerned about different aspects of it. So it's not so black and white, and it's a little bit more difficult when you're sitting here listening to a concerned resident talk to you about a housing project to deal with this. But I wanted you to understand the concept behind why they keep bringing up objective development standards. Tell them in advance, they'll design that way. It should be easy to approve. So objective standards are setbacks, height, lot coverage. You can even have an objective standard that talks about relationship to a neighboring building, but you don't want to say compatible. You can implement subjects such as it has to be stepped back, so it creates separation from your buildings, or articulation requirements. So there's objective things you can do to get to the same compatibility goals. You just we have to do the work to specify what we're looking for. And then explaining the details and characteristics of a particular style of development you want to see and list those components. And I saw a really good example in the R1 standards that you're working on for minimal traditional housing, is I think what it was, and there's a couple other architectural styles that you're going to want to see in those standards. And so listing out the components will be really helpful. You can have limits on blank walls. You can have building frontage requirements, limiting the number of doors or requiring a certain amount of space between doors. You can have material requirements, color requirements. You can even require consistency with neighborhood character according to HCD if you specifically identify what the neighborhood character is and what those elements are. So you see, you're getting more specific. It eliminates opportunities for creativity in your design. And so it's a give and a take. But the things that I want you to take away is there's going to be much more scrutiny on conditioning residential development projects. And so it's really important that you put your expectations in the code through these objective standards. Always know that a deviation to a standard authorized for density bonuses are considered consistent. They're not inconsistent with your code. You may want to, if you think that you have a lot of inconsistencies in your general plan and your zoning, you may want to put some standards in your general plan because the general plan always controls. It's not a traditional planning practice, but it could be advisable if you think there's a lot of inconsistencies. Involve the public in creation of your new standards because they're going to have less ability to object to projects moving forward. At least they'll have some input into the creation of those standards and know what to expect. And it sounds like you've done a lot of public workshops for your R1 standards, so it sounds like that's something that you already do. And then the planning department will have to look closely to identify which standards can be applied and will have close scrutiny of new standards. So that is my summary of the housing laws and what we can expect to be working on over the next year. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know that was a tremendous amount of information, and we also have some written materials that I could provide to the public and the commission if you wanted more summaries of the bills.
Thank you for the presentation. Commissioner Fermenta, do you have any questions? Commissioner Owens?
I have none, thank you. Great presentation.
Commissioner Espadas?
No, great presentation. That was a lot of information. I think I learned on every single page one thing at least. So,
Yeah.
but
Okay,
no
good.
questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I have none. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Very informative.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Is the Director of Community Development aware of any, have any changes to the agenda?
Vice Chairman, we do. But our public hearing item has been withdrawn. And so the item won't be discussed tonight, and that was a request by the applicant.
We still, under our rules, we need to have the commission, when that item comes up, accept the formal written withdrawal letter. So that's an action you'll need to take under our rules.
Should we motion to that effect?
You can actually jump to number 2 on the agenda and do that, if you'd like.
Okay. So, do we,
So for item number 2, the applicant submitted a request to withdraw the application in its entirety. So the motion would be to accept that request for withdrawal of the application and take no further action on this one.
I make a motion to recognize the applicant's withdrawal and take no further action.
Second.
okay, we have a first and a second. Take a vote.
Vote is now open. Please place your votes. And the motion passes with 4 in favor and Chair Dominguez absent to approve the withdrawal of PLN 1900-134 for a variance at 12213 Nice Avenue.
Okay. So, does the Director of Community Development have a report on City Council actions?
Yes, Vice Chair. The City Council met yesterday, and we had 2 items that I thought might be of interest. The City Council approved a pilot program for electric scooters in our community. Pilot program is going to be for 90 days, and the service area is going to be limited to the central part of town. It's bound by Gallatin Road on the north, Imperial on the south, Paramount on the west, and Lakewood and Bellflower on the east. And there was an interest amongst council to see if scooters were appropriate for the community. As you may know, they're a fad in some communities, a lot of coastal communities or larger cities. And once again, council wanted to explore that option to see if they were appropriate here. So staff conducted a procurement. We've got a company by the name of Sun that is going to work with staff on getting those scooters out there. All of the liability generally is on the scooter provider. The city's not going to have any liability in terms of the accidents or so forth. We also listed out prohibited areas for the scooters. Our big intent was not to have any clutter by our intersections, by driveway aprons, by emergency exits, and also have the appropriate ADA clearances on our right-of-ways. So the scooters should be in place in the middle of March, and the 90-day clock will tick after that, and we'll see if the community takes to them. The second item was shopping cart containments. There was an interest by council to create more teeth in our current ordinance in regards to how businesses manage their shopping carts. And our current ordinance doesn't have any strict penalties, nor does it have any specific direction as to how businesses should contain their carts. So the new ordinance introduced a cart containment plan, which is driven by the wheel locks that a lot of the carts use. We also provided an option of a security deposit system similar to what Aldi's uses, and then left an option for the businesses to propose any other containment methods that they might have. All those to be approved by staff, and that should go into place in the next 4 months. And that concludes my comments.
I have a question. How many scooters?
The total deployment is going to be 100. They're going to start with 2 phases. So they'll deploy 50 within 2 weeks of, well, let's say in mid-March. Generally, it's 2 weeks after the adoption of the ordinance. And they're going to assess how that usage is going with the goal of deploying another 50 2 weeks after that initial deployment.
So at this time, or when they're introduced, the 50 and then the 50, no cost to the city?
No cost to the city. Actually, it's the opposite. It's an income generator. The city's staff negotiated with them and was able to double the amount of revenue that we'd receive. We conducted a survey of 13 different cities in the country, and we looked at the median, and we exceeded that median by $10,800 in terms of fee revenue. And that's over that pilot program period of 90 days, and then we also amortized that out for a year to see what that revenue would be.
Having never leased one or rented one, is there tax applied? So the 10% city tax would apply to the user on the rental or the lease of the
Yeah, you know what? I don't know. I've used them quite a bit. And yeah, that's not a question that we've asked our municipalities, but it's a good question. It's something just out of our curiosity that we'll follow up on and let you know.
Thank you.
Any further questions? I have a question. What company are they using for the electric scooters? Because I know there's
It's Sun,
Sun.
S-U-N.
Okay. So, item number 2 is taken care of. Now is the time for non-agenda public comment. If anybody would like to step forward, please give your name, address, and limit your comments to 5 minutes.
Good evening, Honorable Planning Commission and staff. My name is Luis Rodriguez from City Hall Advisors Incorporated at 6745 Washington Avenue, Whittier, California. Regarding the previous item on agenda, that was on the agenda, 12213 Nice Avenue, I would respectfully ask that my name and company be withdrawn from the application documents and any future documentation should the case move forward in the future. I have disassociated myself from the property owner, Mr. Frank Gallo, and his company, Southland Financial, in order to maintain my reputation and good working relationship with the City of Downey's residents and staff. Main concern here is that there are outstanding violations on that property, and my name did appear on the draft resolution on the website with the agenda. When you link it up, it shows my name as the applicant, but I was really the representative. So that's it. I just wanted to make sure that there's a clarification. I wouldn't want my name being dragged through the mud should Mr. Gallo abandon the property and those violations aren't remedied. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Commissioner Owen kind of looked at me, hoping I would respond. The short answer is the documents submitted and prepared in conjunction with this item, we don't redact any information. That's public information. If he's got an issue with his name, he needs to go back to the owners of the property who initiated this application in the first place. Having said all of that, this application isn't moving forward. It got withdrawn. So this is not moving past the Planning Commission. It's not going anywhere because you just approved its withdrawal. So it ended here. But if he has an issue with his name being referenced in documents generated by the owner of the applicant, he can address that with them.
Okay. Anybody else have any comments? Okay, seeing none, now's the time for the consent calendar.
Vice Chair, if I may?
Yes.
In regards to the consent calendar, and that's item number 6, we need Commissioner Owens to abstain from that item. Outside of that, you can vote on them as a block with Commissioner Owens abstaining, and that's an option that you can take.
Okay. Is there a motion? Consent calendar. The consent calendar.
Motion.
This we can approve it as a block. We can do it as a block 3, 4, 5, 6. With Commissioner Owens abstaining on 6.
Correct.
I have a question on number 3. Maybe you can help me. It may have been just a mistake, but on the last line of section 3, resolution number, it says, for this reason, the sale of the parcel on the southwest corner of Lakewood Boulevard and Imperial is consistent with the general plan.
That is a typo. Thanks, good catch.
You just read in the correction, and then you can adopt it as amended. So we just want to read into the record what it really should read, and then you can adopt the resolution as amended.
Mr. Vice Chair, if I may, that sentence will be revised to read, for this reason, the sale of property located at 9340 Stewart and Gray Road is consistent with the general plan.
Okay.
Be to approve the consent calendar with the change noted in the resolution, and with Commissioner Owen abstaining from number 6.
Yes. Is there a motion?
Yeah, I make a motion to approve with the correction on section 3.
Second.
So we have a first and a second. Let's take a vote.
Okay, please place your votes. And the motion passes with 3 in favor and Commissioner Owens abstaining from item number, from the December 4th minutes, December 4th, 2019 minutes, and Chair Dominguez absent.
Okay. Now on to other business. We have election of officers. So do we want to discuss that?
Is the floor open for nomination?
Your Owens?
I'll nominate Miguel Duarte, who's been the vice chair for the past year, to elevate to the position of chair.
Thank you.
I would second that.
Thank you, guys. Wow. Thank you, guys.
I'll motion for the vice chair. I'll motion that Commissioner Fermetta be placed in the vice chair position.
Second.
The motion is for Vice Chair Duarte to be the chairman and for Commissioner Frometta to be the vice chair. And that's one motion for the two positions.
So we had a first and a second, so let's take a vote.
The motion passes to elect Miguel Duarte as chair and Commissioner Frometta as vice chair, with 4 in favor and Chair Dominguez absent. Commissioner Dominguez.
Yeah. Okay.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank
Good
you,
job.
guys. Appreciate it. All right. Do we have any new business, or does any commissioner have any business to discuss? Commissioner Frometta?
I have none.
Commissioner Owens?
None, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Spatos?
I also have none, thank you.
And I have none. Does the Director of Community Development have any additional comments?
No, keeping with the theme, I have no comments tonight.
All right. And we are adjourned. Thank you, gentlemen.